Arthur Jenkins, at 78, had come to believe his useful days were little more than static, a faint, irritating hiss lost in the overwhelming broadcast of a world that had long since tuned him out. He was a ghost from a forgotten channel, a former U.S. Army Signal Corps radio operator whose service during the Korean War felt like a lifetime ago, a sepia-toned photograph in an album no one ever opened. His specialized knowledge, once a source of pride and critical to operations, now seemed as antiquated as the glowing vacuum tubes and crackling Morse code he had once cherished. The digital age had rendered his analog skills quaint, museum pieces in the relentless march of progress. He lived a life of quiet routine in Havenwood, a small, mountain-hemmed town nestled deep in a valley where the peaks seemed to scrape the clouds and the local gossip often resonated louder and with more urgency than any signal he tried to coax from the ether in years. His small, clapboard house, painted a faded blue, stood on the edge of town, its porch overlooking a valley that was breathtakingly beautiful in the summer and starkly isolating in the winter. Mornings were a ritual of lukewarm coffee brewed in an old percolator, the rustle of the Havenwood Gazette, when it arrived on time, and the distant crow of a rooster. Afternoons were dedicated to a small, somewhat unruly vegetable garden where his tomatoes were his pride, their vibrant red a small defiance against the encroaching gray of his days. Evenings were typically surrendered to the flickering, blue-tinged images on an aging television set, its sound often muddled, its stories rarely compelling enough to fully engage him. He was widowed, his beloved Martha gone for over a decade, and his 2 children, successful and busy, lived several states away, their visits loving but infrequent. The annual Havenwood Founders' Day Festival, a tradition dating back over a century, was approaching. It was usually a time when the town, normally sleepy, buzzed with a little more collective energy, a brief, cheerful spark. Preparations were underway, stalls were being painted, bunting ordered, and the local bakery was experimenting with new pie recipes. This year, however, nature, in its indifferent majesty, had other, more dramatic plans. A freak early autumn storm, a ferocious tempest born of colliding weather fronts, gathered its strength in the high peaks before descending upon the unsuspecting valley. It began with an ominous, bruised sky, then a chilling wind that howled through the pines like a banshee. Rain, thick and relentless, turned to sleet, then to a blinding swirl of ice and snow that was unheard of for early October. The storm raged for 12 brutal hours. Trees, ancient sentinels of the valley, snapped like matchsticks under the weight of the ice, there falling a series of thunderous crashes that punctuated the wind's roar. Power lines, coated in shimmering, deadly ice, arced in brilliant, blue-green flashes before surrendering to the strain, plunging Havenwood into a profound and unnerving darkness. By the time a fragile, gray dawn finally broke, the town was a Narnia of destruction, beautiful in its icy sheath but utterly crippled. Havenwood was cut off, from the power grid, from the internet's invisible web, from the comforting reach of cell towers. The modern world, with all its presumed invincibility and instant connectivity, had been silenced, humbled by the raw, primordial power of the elements. A low hum of panic began to thread itself beneath the surface of the town's characteristic stoicism. Mayor Ben Carter, a young man barely 30, energetic and earnest but relatively new to the pressures of such a significant crisis, tried to coordinate assessment and relief efforts. His office in the small town hall, now lit by emergency lanterns and smelling faintly of kerosene, became the de facto command center. But with no way to reach emergency services in the county seat, 30 winding, treacherous miles away, or even the neighboring towns further down the valley, a chilling sense of isolation began to set in. The town's modern, digital emergency radio, a recent acquisition Ben had championed, sat inert on his desk, its screen dark, fried by a power surge during the storm's initial assault despite its surge protector. Several attempts by the town's volunteer fire chief to revive it proved fruitless. "She's dead, Ben," he'd said grimly. "Completely shot." Arthur Jenkins, bundled in an old, moth-eaten service sweater that still bore the faint scent of wool and time, made his way cautiously to the general store. It was one of the few places with some activity, its proprietor, old Jedediah Smith, having a reliable gas generator that kept a few lights on and the coffee pot sputtering. The store was crowded, townspeople huddled together, sharing news, anxieties, and dwindling supplies of D-cell batteries. Arthur listened, a silent observer, to the worried chatter. He heard Mayor Carter, his young face etched with fatigue and frustration, lamenting their inability to report their dire situation or request specialized aid for the elderly and the vulnerable. "If only we had an old ham radio rig, something robust, something that didn't rely on the grid or these delicate circuits," Ben said, more to himself than anyone in particular, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. The words, "old ham radio rig," snagged in Arthur's mind, like a faint, almost forgotten signal struggling to break through decades of static. He saw, in his mind's eye, a dusty corner of his attic, a heavy canvas sheet draped over a familiar shape. His Hallicrafters S-38, a legend in its day, a relic from his active service, and beside it, a carefully packed long wire antenna kit he'd always meant to set up properly, a project deferred year after year until it was forgotten. He hadn't laid hands on it, let alone powered it up, in over 30 years. Could it still work? The thought was a fragile spark in the dimness of his self-imposed obsolescence. He initially dismissed it. Too old. Too long. He was too old. But Ben Carter's tired, worried face stayed with him. He remembered the critical importance of communication from his Signal Corps days, how a single, well-timed message could change everything, could mean the difference between rescue and disaster. He thought of Martha, who had always encouraged him to keep his hand in, to not let his skills fade entirely. He thought of the uneasy silence that had fallen over Havenwood, a silence far more menacing than the storm's fury. He found Mayor Carter an hour later, back at the town hall, poring over a map by lantern light with the fire chief. Arthur cleared his throat, a dry, hesitant sound. "Mr. Mayor," he began, his voice raspy, a little unsteady. I might have something. An old radio. Shortwave. Hallicrafters S-38. It's an antique, I suppose. But it's military grade from its time. Needs a reliable power source, a good length of wire for an antenna, clear height, and probably a fair bit of luck. Ben Carter looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and polite skepticism. He knew Arthur Jenkins mostly as the quiet old fellow who won prizes for his heirloom tomatoes at the Founders' Day Fair, not as a potential communications wizard. "A radio, Mr. Jenkins? From when?" "Korea-era, mostly. But they were built to last, son. Not like these newfangled, throwaway things. No offense." Arthur gestured vaguely at the dead digital unit on the desk. "No guarantees. It's been a long time." Desperation, however, was a powerful persuader. With every other option exhausted, Ben Carter nodded slowly. "If there's a chance, any chance at all, Mr. Jenkins, we have to take it. What do you need?" The journey to Arthur's attic became a small expedition. With the help of 2 young volunteer firefighters, Tom and Dave, strapping lads who looked at Arthur with a kind of curious respect, they navigated the narrow, creaking stairs. The attic was cold, filled with the accumulated detritus of a long life, mothballed clothes, stacks of old magazines, forgotten toys. Under a thick, dusty canvas sheet, just as Arthur remembered, lay the Hallicrafters, its gray metal case surprisingly intact. It was heavy, a solid piece of engineering from a different era. Beside it, a wooden box contained the antenna components, coils of copper wire, insulators, connectors. Getting it down was a struggle. Arthur, though surprisingly agile for his age, found his breath catching, his joints protesting. But a stubborn glint had appeared in his pale blue eyes, a focus that hadn't been there for years. Back at the town hall, the radio was placed carefully on a sturdy table in a small back room that Ben cleared for him. Maria Sanchez, the town's mechanic, a resourceful woman in her early 40s who could coax life out of almost any engine, was brought in. After examining the radio's power requirements, she nodded. "I can rig something from a couple of good car batteries. Give me an hour." While Maria worked, Arthur, with Tom and Dave as his assistants, tackled the antenna. This was the critical part. "We need height, as much as we can get," Arthur explained, his voice gaining a little more of its old parade ground timbre. "And it needs to be clear of obstructions, especially metal." He surveyed the town hall's surroundings. The town's flagpole, a sturdy metal pole that had, by some miracle, remained standing through the storm's onslaught, became their improvised mast. It was a challenging, painstaking process. The wire was cold and stiff, their fingers numb. Arthur, despite his age, climbed partway up a ladder propped against a fire truck to guide the placement, his instructions precise, his knowledge of angles and insulators resurfacing from the depths of his memory. He felt a familiar ache in his shoulders, a twinge in his knees, but also a burgeoning sense of purpose that warmed him more than his old sweater. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, began its descent, casting long, eerie shadows. Maria had successfully rigged a power supply, connecting two heavy-duty batteries in series. The moment of truth was approaching. Arthur meticulously checked every connection one last time, his movements economical, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He cleaned terminals with a small wire brush he'd found in his pocket, his breath misting in the cold air of the improvised radio room. Mayor Carter, the firefighters, and Maria gathered, a silent, expectant audience, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single kerosene lantern. Arthur took a deep breath, a silent prayer on his lips, and then, with a decisive click, he flipped the main power switch. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the vacuum tubes inside the helicrafters began to glow with a faint, warm orange light, like embers being coaxed back to life. A low hum filled the room, a sound Arthur hadn't heard in decades but recognized instantly. It was the sound of potential, of readiness. The hum was followed by a crackle, then a loud, pervasive hiss of static as he switched the set to receive. The sound of the universe, raw and unfiltered. Arthur leaned forward, his ear close to the speaker grill, one hand resting almost reverently on the cool metal case, the other slowly, patiently, turning the large main tuning dial. The illuminated frequency display, a mechanical marvel of gears and painted numbers, crawled across the band. The static ebbed and flowed, rose and fell in intensity, but no discernible signal emerged. Minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour, then half an hour. The initial hope in the room began to fray, replaced by a growing tension. Arthur's face was a mask of concentration, betraying nothing. He remembered long nights in frozen foxholes, straining to pull a vital, life-saving signal out of a similar cacophony. Patience. It was always about patience. "Anything at all, Mr. Jenkins?" Ben Carter finally whispered, unable to bear the suspense any longer. His voice was tight. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head, his eyes closed, listening intently. He adjusted a smaller knob, the beat frequency oscillator. The pitch of the static changed. He nudged the main dial a fraction of a millimeter. Then, through the persistent hiss, almost imperceptibly faint, he caught it, a rhythmic, structured beeping. Morse code. Weak, ghostly, but undeniably there. "Got something," Arthur murmured, his voice low but charged with a sudden energy. A flicker, a definite spark, ignited in his usually placid pale blue eyes. He grabbed a pencil and a worn notepad he'd brought from home, his hand, surprisingly steady, moving with a speed and precision that belied his 78 years, transcribing the dots and dashes as they emerged from the ether. The others leaned in, watching him, their breath held. "It's a weather station," Arthur announced after a minute, looking up. "Automated. About 100 miles east of here, up in the mountains. Still transmitting its data packets. Not who we need to talk to, but it's proof. The old girl still has life. She can hear." A collective sigh of relief, small but audible, went through the room. It wasn't rescue, not yet, but it was a tangible connection, a crack in the wall of their isolation. Now for the real test. Arthur took another deep breath. He reconfigured a few switches on the front panel, the clicks loud in the quiet room. He picked up the old D104 microphone, its chrome surprisingly untarnished. He tapped out a call sign on the telegraph key first, a call sign he hadn't used since he was a young sergeant shivering in a Korean winter, CQ DK2ARJ. Kilo 2 Alpha Romeo Juliet. Calling any station, calling any station. He repeated it 3 times. Then, he keyed the microphone. CQ. This is Kilo 2 Alpha Romeo Juliet, operating emergency power from Havenwood. Havenwood, State. We are isolated due to severe storm damage. Requesting contact with any emergency net or station that can relay our situation. Over. He released the transmit switch. More static. More waiting. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. His shoulders began to ache with a deep, familiar throb. He sent the call again. And again. He tried different frequencies, ones he knew were monitored by amateur radio emergency groups. Just as a new wave of despair threatened to settle, a voice, faint and heavily distorted by static, struggled through. EADU, 5x3. Havenwood, this is K4EZ. Kilo 4 Echo Zulu. County Sheriff's Volunteer Emergency Net, what is your full situation? Over. A jolt, like a mild electric shock, went through Arthur. Maria gasped. Ben Carter's eyes widened. K4EZ, this is K2ARJ. Arthur responded, his voice remarkably clear and calm despite the tremor of emotion he felt. Solid copy, my friend. Havenwood is cut off. Roads blocked by fallen trees and ice. Power out across the entire valley. No telephone, no cell. We estimate at least 50 elderly residents in need of urgent welfare checks, some requiring medication. We need immediate assistance with road clearance and assessment. Over. For the next crucial hour, and then intermittently through the long, cold night, Arthur Jenkins, the quiet old man with the prize-winning tomatoes, became the sole communication link between the stricken town of Havenwood and the outside world. He was methodical, professional, his old signal corps training kicking in as if no time had passed at all. He relayed critical information, coordinated priorities, handled messages with a calm efficiency that amazed Mayor Carter. He took short breaks for lukewarm coffee and a stale sandwich, but mostly he stayed by the glowing dials of the helicrafters, his voice a steady, reassuring presence in the darkness. He was no longer just Arthur Jenkins, forgotten veteran. He was K2ARJ, Havenwood's lifeline. By the next afternoon, the rumble of heavy machinery was heard in the distance. The first snowplows and emergency vehicles, guided in by the precise information Arthur had relayed, began to break through the blockages on the main road. Linemen arrived to begin the monumental task of restoring power. Paramedics, provided with a list Arthur had helped compile, fanned out to check on the town's most vulnerable residents. Arthur, exhausted but filled with a profound, quiet satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years, finally switched off the helicrafters as the first official emergency communication vehicles rolled into town, their own modern radios now functional as they got closer to less damaged infrastructure. He found himself an unlikely, and somewhat reluctant, local hero. Mayor Ben Carter, in a town meeting a few days later, publicly and emotionally thanked him, calling him Havenwood Spark. The Havenwood Gazette, once it was printed again, ran a front-page story with a picture of Arthur beside his radio, the headline proclaiming, "Old Waves, Old Warrior, Save Havenwood." But more important to Arthur than any public recognition was the quiet, steady thrum of purpose that had reawakened within him. The pervasive static that had filled his own life for so long seemed to have finally cleared, replaced by a clear, warm, and steady signal. He felt connected again. He didn't consign the helicrafters S-38 back to the dusty oblivion of the attic. With Maria's help, he set it up properly in a corner of his small living room, running a more permanent long wire antenna out to a tall pine tree in his backyard. He started listening regularly, the voices and codes from around the world a comforting murmur in his quiet house. Occasionally, he'd even tap out a call on the old telegraph key, or pick up the D104 microphone, his call sign, K2ARJ, once again active on the airwaves. Young Ben Carter became a regular visitor, not just as mayor, but as a friend, fascinated by Arthur's stories and his knowledge. A few of the town's curious teenagers, including Tom and Dave, the firefighters who had helped him, also started stopping by. Arthur, initially hesitant, found himself explaining the basics of radio theory, the magic of bouncing signals off the ionosphere, the importance of the Morse code he still knew by heart. He was teaching again, sharing, his experiences no longer just dusty memories, but valuable lessons. He even started a small, informal radio club, meeting once a week at the town library. Arthur Jenkins no longer felt like a relic, an afterthought in a world too busy for his kind. He was a bridge to a resilient past, a voice that had broken through the storm, a quiet testament to the enduring value of skill, experience, and the human spirit. The old spark, rekindled by crisis, now burned brightly, a steady beacon in the small town of Havenwood, a reminder that sometimes, the oldest, most forgotten frequencies carry the signals that matter most. And sometimes, all it takes is for someone to finally tune in.